Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me in the ITV networks. Today with me, Professor Extraordinarius from the University of South Africa, Professor Mahobe Ramose. And before we went into the break, Professor, you were speaking about the importance of being able to articulate knowledge, but from a perspective or from your point of the truth. And if you know that truth and you know that knowledge, then you're not afraid. You can share the knowledge. But it's also the sharing, and this concept of understanding is linked to the entire idea of Ubuntu, which you explain in your book. But I want to ask you this, Professor. Is it, or I feel it, I see it, and I'm sure I know you definitely encounter it, is that when you challenge hegemonic narratives, when you come with an alternate idea, especially when you are considered an other, if you're African, you're Asian, you're Arab, you're Muslim, basically if you're a person that is not white, then the narrative that you have, the perception that you bring, the discussion of the philosophy that you engage in is always considered inferior. Or it is something to be threatened by because you're now challenging white supremacy. And so do we find this kind of a dialogue or this kind of a threat still very prevalent in South Africa? Is that why your writings basically are not the main or prescribed writings in the universities, which it should rightfully be, because we're in a so-called transformed South Africa in a new dispensation, so we should be having new knowledge, new writings, new authors. But I mean, the vision and the articulation that you bring is sidelined.
Thanks. In a way, it is, Quraysha. But you see, this will to exclude others. Superficially, one may see it as, I exclude the others because they have no story to tell. And that means, in a deep way, those who exclude actually believe themselves to be holders of the one and only truth. Nothing could be more self-deceptive than that. Truth, according to us, from an Ubuntu philosophical perspective, is not something that you acquire once and for all time. Truth is always in the making. Yes. And it emerges and arises out of human interaction. In changing existential conditions all the time. So even those who exclude are not only presenting dogma, but they are at the same time manifesting their own fear. They are afraid of being not challenged by that. They're not that. The challenge is not the issue. The issue that they are afraid of is actually to get to know themselves better. They are afraid to get to know themselves better. Because if they were to open up, they would see that dogmatism is, in the first instance, totally against the spirit of science, because the very science that they preach demands openness. Now, why do you become closed? By excluding others. You are no longer scientific. If you do so, you are also anti-philosophical, because you exclude the possibility for a dialogical encounter which can lead to transformation, not only in the external sense of transforming the conditions that prevail, it can also transform you. So they are afraid not only of the other in the first instance, but they are afraid of themselves.
But exactly what you're saying raises in my mind something that is very close to me, and that is the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you look at the way in which Zionism as an ideology is preached, it is this whole concept of the other, firstly, and the secondly, a belittling of our people, thirdly, the exclusion of our people, and then fourthly, the entire notion that perhaps what we have is the absolute truth, the absolute best, and so you do not deserve to be part of us. So in terms of world politics, how do you then see Israel?
In fact, I'm glad you raised this point of Israel because it reminds me of a BBC documentary called Izkor. I believe it is actually one of the words in Hebrew, but it means remember.
Okay.
So this documentary shows the educational system in Israel and many other aspects about Israel. So when I watched and considered it, at the time I was actually teaching philosophy of law in the Netherlands. And so I was struck by many things. What does it mean to remember? That is one. Mm-hmm. The other thing that struck me was this deep sense of identification. I am a Jew. And of course, another one can say, I am an Afrikaner. Another one can. Now, what I found very problematical and still find problematical with all this, I am a Palestinian, I'm an Israeli. What I find problematical is that it goes back to yet another program of the BBC called In the Blood. Now, when you complete the sentence, it means, in the blood we are one, divided we stand. Now, we are actually one people. We are just one human race.
Sure.
I think what we need to understand from that, I mean, really, to just illustrate the point, I am sure there is nothing in nature which prevents me from meeting a Japanese woman and giving that woman a baby if everything is normal. Is that baby not going to be a human being? Are we going to call that baby colored? That baby is not colored. Colored, these identifications are just problems. The erection of boundaries where we need none. The baby that I can have with a Russian lady has a name and must be called by that name because it is just as human as the baby that I can have with a black woman in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in Ghana, in everywhere. So these identities are really an attempt to deny what we all are. In the blood, we are one. Even medical science would not make sense. Why do you export medicines to other countries if we are not one in the blood? You see, so I think that we really have to begin thinking seriously in terms of humanness. And that is where Ubuntu comes in. It teaches us not about humanism, but about humanness, being a human being with other human beings. So the Palestinian-Israeli question, I think, should really be looked at from that perspective. Now, what I'm getting at is that the construction of these problems has a very direct link with what we believe Yahweh is saying, with what we believe what Allah is saying. And this belief, if it dies, if the object of our belief is dead, or if it is not dead, but it shows that it is possible to cohabit, then of course we have a happy ending. But now in terms of real politics, in West politics, we already had nuclear alert in the 70s when Israel was threatened. And that reminded me of the insightful point. You remember that Bertrand Russell used to debate with J.F. Kennedy about this use of the nuclear weapons. And it is the same Bertrand Russell who argues in his book on nuclear weapons and common sense. You know, no single ideology at all could justify the use of nuclear weapons or even the exclusion of the other. Ideologies are there for discussion if we understand democracy. So I see that we can even begin to think of avoiding the imminent and living danger these days of nuclear omnicide simply by trying our best to make both sides in the conflict, the Palestinians and the Jewish people, understand and just we one people as human beings.
Okay, but you raise an important point, and that is, in many ways, you're looking at it as a religious discussion or perhaps a religious conflict, and I think it's more than that. But we've come to the end of this particular interview. When we come back in the following segment of the second interview, actually, when we raise the discussions further, I want you to touch again on this particular aspect and tell me if you really believe that it is religious or there's more about it, and that is about the constructs that we put to ourselves in terms of our humanness. But that brings us to the end of this particular episode of Finding Me. Next week, join me for part 2 in the further discussion with Professor Ramose. So we'll see you next week, inshallah. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.